Once again, we have some great links below walking you through this concept of mutual funds, and I'll just be hitting a few high-level points. So the three kinds of mutual funds are open-ended funds, closed-ended funds, and exchange-traded funds, often called ETFs. The related term that you need to know about each of these is a prospectus, and a prospectus outlines what those funds are going to do with your money if you hand it to them. So how does an open-ended mutual fund work? Well, really simple. You hand them money, and they invest your money. If you sell and want your money back, they sell what they've invested in and hand you the money back. Really straightforward. There's a term called NAV, it's net asset value. It's basically the value of the fund, assets minus liabilities, essentially. And open-ended means that anyone can show up and invest more, or people could start selling and it could shrink the fund as well. So the more that they get, the bigger they get, and the more the fund invests. Relatively straightforward of put money in, it gets bigger, take money out, it gets smaller. A closed-end fund, well, how does a closed-end fund work? A closed-end fund, it raises the initial money to invest, but then you can't add to it or take away from the investment. So you might be thinking, well, how do I get my money out of this thing? Well, you just sell your position to someone else. It basically acts very similar to a stock, but instead of a stock in a company, you kind of own a stock in a mutual fund that is invested in other stocks. Closed-end mutual funds, they generally are more complex. They tend to have higher fees. And much of the time, it's not worth the additional hassle compared to open-end funds unless you really know what you're doing. As far as for your purposes, chances are you just shouldn't touch them, just ignore them and kind of move on. But that's going to depend on, of course, your situation. And so could you answer the question, what is the difference between a closed-end mutual fund and an open-ended mutual fund? With that backdrop, what is an exchange-traded fund, also known as ETFs? So how do they work? It's basically like a closed-ended fund and an open-ended fund had a baby, and they're called ETFs. So what's the difference between ETFs and its two parents, open-ended fund and closed-ended fund? Well, it can trade at any time, kind of like the closed-ended fund, but it can also change in value, like the open-ended fund. So you can sell it, buy it, or sell it during the day very, very easily, but also at the end of the day, the ETF could change in value. Usually, in order to make this work, the funds that put them together, it's more than 20 years ago now, I guess, is when ETF started. They're usually very large, and they tend to have these very low fees, which is very nice and attractive. We like low fees, right? So they're efficient, kind of like the open-ended funds, and have low fees. And on top of this, you can have ETF funds for other asset classes. You could have an ETF for a bond fund, for example, or all sorts of different ETFs. So it can be quite convenient to use these exchange-traded funds. So in the link below, there's a quick summary of comparing the three of closed-end, open-end, and ETFs, which is very useful. And just for me personally, I tend to stick with low-cost open-ended funds, generally index funds or ETFs. Very low hassle, very straightforward, low fees, work well. So what are the different types of mutual funds that are out there that belong into, say, open-ended fund or ETF? And these types below that I'm going to quickly walk through, they're not mutually exclusive. You could kind of combine these concepts together. But very quickly, there's what's called a fund of funds, and that's when there's a mutual fund that invests in other funds, and that can make sense occasionally. There are also lifestyle funds, and a lifestyle fund, it automatically adjusts its investing strategy according to your age. So you say you have a lifestyle fund with a target retirement date of 2065, then when it's far away from 2065, it's going almost entirely into equities, and as it gets closer to 2065, it dials down the level of risk or shifts it down on CAPM so it's not quite so volatile. There are also inverse funds, and if you've ever seen The Big Short, maybe you have an idea of kind of what that could look like. So you win big when things go really, really poorly. I would not recommend them for you. And there are also leveraged funds. And leveraged funds, you borrow a bunch of money, and when things go up, things go way up. And when things go poorly, you can lose everything. I would not recommend them. When people ask me for a quick explanation of leverage funds, I send them to this clip. It's one of my favorites to explain this concept, and I've included it in the links below. Lifestyle funds have exploded in popularity, and for a few good reasons. First, a low-expense lifestyle index fund can be ideal for your scenario that you are in. For many people, that could be ideal. So it passively invests across a whole bunch of equity indices while you're young, and then it slowly transitions to these diversified bond funds as you get older. So the older you are, the lower your appetite is for risk, the less you're willing to roll the dice for everything. And the fund handles this risk change over time for you. So if it's a low expense fund, it can do it very efficiently. What are the different terms for the expenses for mutual funds? There's the front end load, where you pay money up front. There's the back end load, where you pay money when you sell. And there can be a 12B1 fee, which is marketing. And for the most part, most people prefer no load funds, where they just get charged the normal expense ratio. There's no extra fee added onto it. There can be short-term redemption fees, which if you say invest in an investment fund, in a mutual fund, and sell it typically within 90 days, they will dock you for a certain small percentage of it, say 0.5% or something like that. That's most common from what I've seen at present with international funds, which is actually pretty reasonable because there are some costs associated with deploying those funds internationally across, say, 35 different markets. So it kind of makes sense. So the main number you should be focusing on, I mean, besides the no-load fund, is that the expense ratio. And there are lots of great investment funds out there that don't exceed 0.5%, and even as low as 0.2% or even lower if you're investing at least $2,500. So lots of really great investment funds out there that are relatively inexpensive that are index funds. Finally, for some funds, you can opt to either reinvest, say the dividends or whatever it happens to be, or to distribute those extra funds to you. Unless you need those distributions, I mean, most people will just opt to reinvest.